Midnight Caller, a short story by Misty Hamilton Smith. Copyright 2025. It started with a ring, not the shrill, modern chirp of a smartphone that had become the soundtrack to her daily existence, but the deep, resonant chime of an old rotary phone, the kind that shouldn't have been in Nora's apartment. The sound reverberated through the cramped space like a funeral bell, each note hanging in the air with an almost physical weight. She didn't own one. She hadn't seen one in years, not since her grandmother's house had been cleared out after the funeral. The memory of dusty attics and mothballed furniture flickered through her mind, but there it was, sitting on the kitchen counter when she came home from work. Black, heavy, dustless, waiting. The late afternoon sun slanted through her grimy window, casting long shadows across the linoleum floor, but the phone seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. Its presence felt wrong, like finding a stranger's shoes in your closet or discovering a room in your house you'd never noticed before. She stared at it for a long time, her keys still dangling from her trembling fingers, unsure whether to touch it. The familiar scents of her apartment coffee grounds, vanilla candle wax, and the faint mustiness of old books seemed muted, overwhelmed by something else. Something cold and metallic that made her nostrils flare with recognition she couldn't quite place. It didn't make sense. Her apartment was locked. She'd checked the deadbolt twice this morning, the way she always did since the break-ins started happening in the building. No one had been inside. The dust on her coffee table remained undisturbed, her stack of unopened mail exactly where she'd left it. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she approached the counter, each footstep echoing louder than it should in the small space. The phone's receiver gleamed like polished obsidian, and she could see her own reflection distorted in its surface pale, wide-eyed, afraid. She picked it up. It was cold. Not just cool to the touch, but bone-deep cold that seemed to seep through her palm and travel up her arm like ice water in her veins. The weight of it surprised her solid, substantial, real to real. She turned it over in her hands, examining the rotary dial with its perfectly arranged numbers, the coiled cord that shouldn't have been connected to anything but somehow was. Her breath misted slightly in the suddenly frigid air. That night, at exactly midnight, it rang. The sound shattered the silence of her bedroom like breaking glass. Nora bolted upright, her cotton nightgown clinging to her sweat-dampened skin despite the cold that had settled into her bones. The red digits of her alarm clock glowed accusingly. 12 a.m., the ringing continued, each chime deliberate and measured, patient as death itself. She didn't answer. Her bare feet touched the cold hardwood floor as she crept toward the kitchen, drawn by a mixture of terror and morbid curiosity. The phone sat in darkness, but somehow she could see it clearly, as if it generated its own pale light. The ringing filled her skull, vibrated in her teeth, made her vision blur at the edges. The next night, it rang again. This time she was ready, sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of tea that had long gone cold, watching the minute hand of the wall clock crawl toward 12. When the first chime sounded, her entire body flinched as if she'd been slapped. The sound was different tonight, deeper, more insistent. It seemed to come from inside her head as much as from the phone itself. She let it ring until it stopped 20-7 rings. She counted them, her fingernails digging crescents into her palms with each one. When silence finally returned, it felt heavier than before, pregnant with waiting. She could taste copper in her mouth blood from where she'd bitten her tongue to keep from screaming. On the third night, she answered. Her hand moved without conscious thought, fingers wrapping around the receiver like a condemned woman reaching for the noose. The cold plastic burned against her ear as she lifted it. "Hello." Her voice came out as barely a whisper, throat raw from 2 nights of suppressed sobs. Silence, not empty silence, but the kind filled with presence. She could hear breathing, slow, deliberate, intimate, her own breath fogged in the suddenly arctic air of her apartment, and goosebumps erupted along her arms like a field of tiny grave markers. Then a voice, low and familiar, speaking through what sounded like miles of static and years of distance.
"You left me."
Nora's breath caught in her throat, trapped there like a bird in a cage. The voice was male, soft, sad. It carried the weight of abandonment, of promises broken, of love turned to ash. Every nerve in her body screamed at her to hang up, to run, to wake up from this nightmare, but she remained frozen. The receiver welded to her ear by something stronger than fear. "Who is this?" But even as she asked, her heart was already providing the answer, dredging up memories she'd spent years burying.
"You know."
She hung up with a crash that seemed to echo through the apartment long after the sound should have died. Her hands shook so violently she could barely grip the counter, knuckles white against the fake granite surface. The taste of bile rose in her throat, sharp and acrid, but she did know it was David, her brother, dead for 12 years. The admission hit her like a physical blow, doubling her over the kitchen counter as sobs tore from her chest. She hadn't spoken about him in nearly as long. Not to her therapist during their carefully orchestrated sessions where she discussed everything, except the one thing that mattered. Not to her parents during their stilted monthly phone calls filled with weather reports and health updates. Not to anyone. His name had become a wound too tender to touch, a scar that never quite healed. David had vanished one night after a fight. They'd argued something stupid, something cruel that started over borrowed money and escalated into years of accumulated resentment. She'd said things she couldn't take back, words that tasted like poison even as they left her lips. He'd walked out the door, his dark hair catching the porch light one last time, and never returned. She could still see the set of his shoulders, the way he'd paused at the threshold, as if waiting for her to call him back. She never did. They found his car near the river 3 days later. Empty driver's door, hanging open like a mouth frozen in a scream. His wallet was still there, his keys dangling from the ignition, but David himself had vanished as completely as if he'd never existed. No body, no answers, just silence that stretched like a chasm through the years, swallowing birthdays and holidays and all the conversations they'd never have, until now. The phone rang again the next night. The sound slicing through her restless sleep like a scythe. She'd been dreaming of David memories twisted into nightmares where his face dissolved, like smoke every time she tried to focus on it. She didn't answer. Her entire body trembled as she lay in bed, covers pulled over her head like a child hiding from monsters. But the ringing continued. Relentless, patient, eternal. She unplugged it. The cord came free with a spark that briefly illuminated her kitchen in harsh white light. The smell of ozone filled the air, sharp and electric, like the moments before a thunderstorm. It rang anyway. The sound was impossible, defying every law of physics and sanity she'd ever believed in. It rang from somewhere beyond electricity, beyond the physical world, from a place where logic held no sway. She threw it in the trash. Her hands burned where they'd touched the phone, red welts rising on her palms like stigmata. The heavy thud as it hit the bottom of the garbage can seemed final, decisive. She tied the bag with shaking fingers and dragged it to the dumpster behind her building. Leaving it there in the pre-dawn darkness, it rang from the trash. The sound drifted up from the dumpster, muffled but unmistakable. Other tenants began turning on their lights, peering through windows with confused, frightened faces. Someone shouted about calling the police, but what could she tell them? That her dead brother's ghost was calling her on a phone that shouldn't exist. She smashed it with a hammer. The claw hammer felt heavy in her grip as she retrieved the phone from the dumpster, her bare feet slipping on the frost-covered asphalt. Each blow sent shards of black plastic flying, mixed with sparks that shouldn't have been there. The sound of breaking echoed off the surrounding buildings like gunshots in the night. It rang from the shattered pieces, even destroyed. Even reduced to fragments scattered across her kitchen floor, it continued to ring. The sound seemed to come from each individual piece. A chorus of mechanical voices calling her name in frequencies that made her teeth ache. The next morning the phone was again whole and sitting on the kitchen counter. She stopped sleeping. Coffee became her only sustenance. Bitter and black, consumed by the pot rather than the cup. Her eyes grew red-rimmed and hollow, her skin pale as paper. She would pace her apartment in endless circles, checking and rechecking locks. Jumping at every sound from the hallway or the street below, she stopped eating. Food turned to ash in her mouth. Every swallow a struggle against a throat that seemed to close with grief and terror. Her clothes began to hang loose on her shrinking frame, and her reflection in the bathroom mirror showed a stranger with haunted eyes and sharp cheekbones. She started listening. Each night, the voice grew clearer, more real, more heartbreakingly familiar. It carried the cadence of shared jokes and whispered secrets, of late-night conversations when they were children afraid of the dark. It was David's voice, aged by death and distance, but unmistakably his.
You left me.
The accusation cut through her like a blade, precise and cruel.
You forgot me.
This was worse, the idea that she'd moved on, that life had continued without him.
You lied.
And this was worst of all, because it was true. She tried to reason with it, to apply logic to the impossible. You're not real. But even as she said it, she could feel the lie burning on her tongue.
I am.
The voice carried such conviction, such pain, that she almost believed it, almost wanted to believe it. You're dead. The words tasted like grave dirt, like the flowers she'd never placed on a headstone that didn't exist.
I'm not.
And in that moment, she could almost see him not as he was when he died, but as he would be now, 12 years older, changed by whatever place he'd been waiting in. What do you want? The question that had been burning inside her since the first ring, the one she was terrified to hear answered.
To come home.
Such simple words, but they contained multitudes of longing, of displacement, of a wandering spirit seeking rest. The voice began to tell her things. Things only David would know. Childhood memories that made her cry at the time. They'd built a fort out of couch cushions and told ghost stories until dawn. The way he'd held her hand during their grandmother's funeral when she was too young to understand death. Secrets that made her laugh despite her terror, how he'd covered for her when she'd crashed Dad's car. The crush she'd had on his best friend that he'd never told anyone about. The name of the boy she'd kissed behind the bleachers in 8th grade. A secret she'd never shared with another living soul. It told her about the night he disappeared.
You didn't mean it.
And his voice carried forgiveness she didn't deserve.
But you said it.
I was angry, she pleaded. The memory crashed over her like a wave, the fury that had consumed her, the words that had poured out like venom. She'd been 22, convinced she knew everything, convinced he was throwing his life away.
You said you wished I was gone.
Each word was a nail in her coffin, a reminder of the moment her anger had transformed into something unforgivable. I didn't mean it, she keeps saying slowly over and over. But they both knew the power of words spoken in rage, how they could wound deeper than any blade.
But I was.
Gone, banished, erased from the world, as if her wish had been granted. By some cruel deity, she cried. The tears came in torrents. 12 years of suppressed grief pouring out of her like blood from a wound. She cried until her throat was raw, until her eyes were swollen shut, until her body had no more moisture left to give. She begged, "Please forgive me. Please come back. Please give me a chance to take it back." The words tumbled over each other, desperate and broken. A prayer to a God she wasn't sure was listening. She apologized. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I've been sorry every day since you left. I would take it all back if I could. I would trade places with you. I would do anything." And she meant it, every word carved from her soul and offered up like a sacrifice.
I forgive you.
3 words that lifted a weight she'd been carrying for 12 years. A burden that had bent her spine and aged her beyond her years. She slept for the first time in days. Dreamless sleep. The kind that comes after confession, after absolution. She woke feeling lighter, almost human again. Sunlight streaming through her windows like a blessing. But the calls didn't stop. They changed. Other voices joined. David's in their midnight chorus. A woman sobbing raw. Desperate sounds that made Nora's heart clench with sympathetic pain. A child laughing in innocent joy twisted into something wrong. Something that raised the hair on her arms and made her check. All the locks twice. A man screaming sounds of agony so profound, they seemed to tear holes in reality itself. Each call came at midnight. As regular as a heartbeat, as inevitable as death. Each call knew her, spoke her name, knew her fears. Understood her guilt in ways that made her feel naked and exposed. She stopped going to work. The outside world became foreign, threatening. The thought of leaving her apartment, of facing questions she couldn't answer, of pretending to be normal when her entire reality had shifted, became impossible. She stopped leaving the apartment. Groceries were delivered. Bills went unpaid. The world beyond her door ceased to exist, narrowed down to 4 walls and the phone that had become the center of her universe. She sat by the phone, waiting. Hours blended into days, days into weeks. She became a satellite orbiting a black hole, pulled inexorably towards something she couldn't escape. One night, the voice said,
"It's time."
For what? But she already knew, had known since the first ring.
To come with us.
The invitation was gentle, almost kind, but underneath she could hear the vast loneliness of the place they wanted to take her. "I can't." A lie. She could. She wanted to.
You can.
And she could hear the smile in David's voice. The same smile he'd worn when convincing her to sneak out after bedtime, or try the roller coaster that terrified her. The next day, she found a newspaper clipping on her doorstep. The paper was yellowed with age, the ink faded but still legible. It was dated 12 years ago, the day after David's car was found. It showed a photo of David younger, smiling, alive. The headline read, "Body of missing man found in river." That wasn't true. They'd never found him. She would have known. She would have been at the funeral, would have thrown dirt on his coffin, would have had a place to grieve. The clipping felt real in her hands, solid and undeniable. But it contradicted everything she knew. She called her mother. The phone rang 3 times before her mother's familiar voice answered, thick with sleep and confusion. "Nora, honey, what's wrong?" "It's 3 in the morning," her mother sobbed when Nora asked about the newspaper clipping. "I didn't want you to know." The words came between gasps, 12 years of hidden truth spilling out. Why? But Nora already knew, could feel the answer settling in her stomach like lead. He left a note. 3 words that changed everything that rewrote history. What did it say? She had to ask, even though she didn't want to know. It said he was sorry. Her mother's voice broke completely. He said he couldn't live with what you'd said to each other. He said he was tired of fighting. He said he loved you. Nora hung up without saying goodbye, the receiver falling from numb fingers. That night, the phone rang. She answered on the first ring, her voice steady for the first time in weeks. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm so sorry."
I know.
David's voice was closer now, as if he was standing right beside her. "Can I see you?" The question she'd been afraid to ask, the one that would seal her fate.
Yes.
The apartment grew cold, the temperature plummeting until her breath came in white puffs and frost began forming on the windows. The lights flickered, strobing between brightness and darkness like a lighthouse beacon. The phone glowed with an inner light that hurt to look at directly. Pulsing with the rhythm of a heart, she bent her body down toward the phone resting on the counter. It appeared to swell in size the closer she came, or perhaps she was shrinking, drawn into its orbit by forces beyond her comprehension. She touched it. The cold burned through her skin, through muscle and bone, straight to her soul. She felt herself dissolving, becoming part of the static between worlds, joining the chorus of voices that called out in the darkness. She vanished, not disappeared. Vanished, as if she'd never existed at all. The apartment exhaled, releasing held breath, returning to normal temperature and light. The next morning, her apartment was deserted. The landlord found it exactly as she'd left it. Coffee cups growing mold, bills scattered on the counter, a life interrupted mid-sentence. But there was no sign of Nora herself, no indication of where she might have gone. The phone was gone too. No one remembered seeing it. No one could explain how it had gotten there, or where it might have gone. It existed only in the spaces between memory and reality, in the static that connects all voices across time and distance. But every night at midnight, in the apartment above hers, someone hears a ring. Deep, resonant, patient. The new tenant, a young man who reminds the neighbors of someone they can't quite place, has learned not to answer it. He's learned to pull his pillow over his head and wait for the ringing to stop, until he can't. "Hello? Who is there?" And someone answers, a woman's voice, familiar yet strange, speaking words of forgiveness and regret into the darkness. And sometimes, if you listen very carefully through the thin walls, you can hear her laughing. The sound of a sister finally coming home. We hope you've enjoyed this original story by Misty Hamilton Smith. Whether it chilled, moved, or inspired youth, there's more to come. Like, share, and subscribe for fresh fiction across every genre, every mood, and every moment.